Welcome to the CLB Forge podcast, brought to you by CLB North American Mission. This is the show to help equip you and your church for mission, ministry, and multiplying disciples.
Welcome to episode 57. My name is Lindsay Rosado. I'm very excited to be joining the Forge team as a host. And today, Ryan Nilsson is here to talk about another Church on Track episode. This is the latest part of the Church on Track series. And we've talked about different things Brian has really talked about different things that that will get your church off track. And now we're talking more about positive, sort of small shifts that can get a church back on track. And here there are seven, right, Ryan? Seven things that we're covering in this series. The first is from social club to missionary outpost. This week's episode is going to be from gathered to scattered. The third is from evangelist to missionary. The fourth is from doing to equipping. The fifth is from committees to teams. The sixth is from unspoken to written. And the seventh is from internal to external. So Ryan, tell us a little bit about some of these terms. What is gathered to scattered?
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. So this is a way to kind of help us recalibrate and reset how we think about what the church is and when are we the church. Over time, in the last couple of centuries, I think we've come to really have a narrowed view of what church is and when we are effectively being the church. And we tend to think of it as primarily when we are gathered together, when Christians are together in the same place at the same time, and the things we do there, that's the church. And scattered is while we are separate and apart and in different places. And I mean, we've really felt that during COVID, like missing those times when we are gathered and not having those. That's been rough. Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So those are the two concepts we're talking about today. What the church while we are together as believers, but also the church while we are scattered in all kinds of different places. And kind of a great example of this, we find in Acts chapter 7 and 8, really in Acts chapter 8, where the church is facing persecution and is being scattered. And there's a persecution that breaks out right after Stephen is killed. He's one of the seven that are in charge of they're in charge of the food distribution for the church. But Stephen is also he just these guys that are leading this ministry, they just wind up also preaching the gospel. Yeah. And Stephen's while doing that, and he gets killed while he's doing that. So Lindsay, can you start reading right there we're going to read Acts 7:59 through 8:8. And if you can start right where Stephen is being killed after having preached.
Okay. While they were stoning him, Stephen prayed, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." And then he fell on his knees and cried out, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." When he had said this, he fell asleep, and Saul approved of their killing him. On that day, a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Godly men buried Stephen and mourned deeply for him, but Saul began to destroy the church. Going from house to house, he dragged off both men and women and put them in prison. Those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went. Philip went down to a city in Samaria and proclaimed the Messiah there. When the crowds heard Philip and saw the signs he performed, they all paid close attention to what he said. For with shrieks, impure spirits came out of many, and many who were paralyzed or lame were healed. So there was great joy in that city.
All right. Thanks, Lindsay.
No problem.
Yeah. So while this story is about persecution and we're seeing stories about people relocating geographically, that's not really what we're talking about today or saying is necessary. But there are some principles at play here that we really can learn a great deal from. So I want to kind of drill down into some of those. So,
okay.
So we see in this account, like the church is told earlier, by Jesus to go out of Jerusalem to into Judea, the rest of the region, and into Samaria, the neighboring region, into the ends of the earth, which is kind of understood to be like the known world. But they hadn't yet. The church is growing and it's getting bigger and bigger, but it's still like mostly hunkered down in Jerusalem. And they weren't going and doing yet what Jesus said they were to do. And persecution was a terrible, terrible moment, in a traumatic moment in the life of the church. And yet God used it to trigger movement and change within the church.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so we see, as we keep reading through Acts, like this is something that scattered Christians, they left Jerusalem and they went to all kinds of different places, but they were still the church. Even though they couldn't gather, they could never really go back to what they had before.
Mm-hmm.
They couldn't get together the way they had before either. But they were still the church, and they'd probably never be gathered in one place again ever.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, can you imagine what that must have felt like?
A little bit,
It hit
though,
me.
kind of, right? Like, I feel like this past year has felt a lot like that. It's like, are we ever
Yeah.
going to be able to go back to what it was before? At least that's a question I've thought about, is like, is church ever going to be the way it was
Yeah.
before? We'll be together, but is it going to feel the same way? Is the experience going to be the same? But it's just really, I think, a relevant thing to think about.
Yeah, you're right. You're right,
Yeah.
Lindsay. Yeah. So even though things would never be the same again, they continue to do the work of the church.
Mm-hmm.
And we see here, as we read on, like the church grew. So they go to this, Christianity reaches all these other cities, not just in Samaria, but in Judea, but the ends of the earth, all around the Roman Empire. And we read those stories through the rest of the book of Acts. And the hub of the church, the headquarters, like the capital, eventually it moves on to other cities as Christians go, and that scattering continues.
Mm-hmm.
There are new kind of centers of Christian life, like Antioch and Rome and Alexandria, and many other cities. And with the departure, another interesting thing too is with the departure of the Christians from Jerusalem, even that their absence in Jerusalem, it may have led to more people becoming followers of Christ in Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this interesting verse there. In verse 2, it says, um, godly men buried Stephen and mourned deeply for him.
Mm-hmm.
The Christians, they've left, except for, I think, the apostles, maybe. Yeah, all except the apostles were scattered. It doesn't say the apostles buried him. It says these godly men. And there's some who think that these godly men may have been former Pharisees, or Pharisees who
Oh,
converted to, we don't know, it's speculation, but
yeah.
maybe people that Jesus was teaching that were
Mm-hmm.
skeptics at the time, watching the church grow and face adversity. They may have come to faith through this scattering of the church and seeing the church continue in a new way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's an interesting observation.
Yeah. So
So
yeah, I'm not saying that we pray for persecution or that we focus on doing exorcisms, but this part of Acts reminds us like that about some of these truths about who the church is and when we are the church, that
yeah.
we see affirmed in other parts of Scripture. But I find that little account really fascinating.
Yeah. But I know, so Ryan, I know you have 3 points for how you can, what it means to bring the church from gathered to scattered. So let's move through those. The first being, we are still the church, even when we're not gathered.
Yeah, that's right. So there is this, we have this huge focus on the gathered moments of the church, right? So when we are going to a worship service, we say we are going to, what do we
Church.
say? What's that?
Right? Church.
Yeah, we're going to church.
Yeah.
If we're going to the building, we say we're going to
church.
And and that's kind of wrong. We're going to the church's property, or we're going to the church's worship service. But that kind of shows you how much emphasis we have come to place on the gathered expressions of the church.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I am not at all talking about dropping out of attending worship. Like, we are clearly called to gather, and it is good to be gathered. Absolutely. And actually, sad to say, like, we see a lot of that today during COVID as we're coming out of the pandemic. People are, some people can't regather for medical
Mhm.
reasons, and they're making wise choices to protect loved ones. But there are others who you see, like, we probably all have friends who are like, they're going to ball games and the mall and
Mhm.
all kinds of these places where there are all these gatherings, but they're not coming to worship to keep safe.
Yep.
And they've kind of gotten out of the habit. And scripture talks about that too in Hebrews 10:25. Let us not get out of the habit of gathering together. Did I just like
Mhm.
totally butcher that verse? Oh man.
Which one?
Hebrews
10:25.
10:25.
Do you want me to read it to you? Because I pulled it up just as a
Oh, please
precaution.
do. Yeah. Please do. I think I
Hebrews 10:25 says, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near.
yeah. So
Mhm.
this is not the podcast about stopping attending worship. And churches have a huge challenge right now to help regather the church.
Yeah.
And I don't want to minimize that one bit. It's so important. It's
Mhm.
so critical. And but we have over the last decades or century had a really huge focus on the gathered moments of the church. But um, we had an episode very early on in the pandemic where one of our guests said that COVID gives us a chance to put Sunday morning in its rightful place, and it kind of reminds us that um, let's put it this way: if we're only the church, if we think that we're only the church when we're gathered, we're missing out on a huge part of God's calling
Yeah.
in our lives.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really interesting. So moving on to your second point, you say uh, when we focus solely on being gathered, we miss out on what God has for us. So expand
Oh
on that
yeah,
a little bit.
that is the second point. I think I just
Yeah.
said something like that. Yeah, yeah.
um,
So,
yeah,
oh,
go ahead.
yeah. When we over focus on the worship experience, um, we risk missing out on realizing that we also have a mission that God has given to us. So I think historically we have over focused on the gathering of the church and forgotten that God has given us a mission that necessarily, yes, some of it happens in the worship experience, but much of it
Mm-hmm.
happens outside that.
Mm-hmm.
Much of it happens when we are not together, like we see in Acts 8.
Mm-hmm.
That preaching of the gospel, that was happening when they were not gathered. And because of that, the church grew.
Yeah.
In Lutheran circles, like we're a part of a Lutheran family of churches, and the worship service is really important in Lutheranism because that's where we receive word and sacrament, the means of grace. We believe that God delivers his life-giving grace to us through the words of the Bible and through communion, through baptism, and we experience those things in our worship services. So it's hugely important. But there's this like Lutheran scholar named Dean Natisday, and he wrote about this a while ago, and he said that we Lutherans have confused the ministry means with the ministry ends. In other words, we have looked at he I think what he's saying is that word and sacrament, gathering for worship, is the means by which we accomplish the ministry ends,
Mm-hmm.
our mission and purpose. And we've mistakenly said it's the ends. Like, we've come to think the purpose of being a Christian is to gather for worship.
Mm-hmm.
But really, we're gathering for worship to so that we can go and accomplish our purpose.
Right. It's interesting to think about too from sort of a private versus public perception of faith, because I think maybe part of why we focus on our attendance at these gatherings is that that's what people see, right? So it's very like,
Yeah. Oh
sorry,
yeah.
this is a little bit of
Yep.
a tangent, but like
Yeah.
I'm perceived as being a good Christian, quote unquote, because I'm there at a gathering. And if that no longer becomes a barometer for my public perception of my faith, like what's the rest of it for? It's just an interesting idea on like
Yeah.
how we perform our faith, I think. So sorry, that was a little tangenting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well,
Yeah.
and you actually can think about that in another way too. Church attendance has dropped, significantly over the last few decades, really
Mm-hmm.
since the 1960s. And I think at the beginning of that time period, it was seen to be culturally preferable to be to attend a church,
Yep.
to be a member of a church and to go every Sunday. It raised your standing in the community.
Mm-hmm.
Nowadays, um, we really live in a post-Christian society where uh, not only will you probably won't be regarded, you may not be regarded highly for attending a church. You may
Mm-hmm.
actually be regarded with inferiority
Mm-hmm.
and seen as morally inferior if you attend a church.
Mm-hmm.
And so those who have attended for cultural reasons, for that they have a nominal faith, or they've done it for because it looks good, a lot of those people have stopped participating. There's
Mm-hmm.
no, they thought that was the benefit,
Yeah.
and so they've discovered that really there's no benefit there, so they
Mm-hmm.
stopped doing it.
Yeah. I know you have a book recommendation too, Ryan, but this is now totally me just talking to you being on a tangent.
Yeah, well, let's hear it.
But there's a great book by I know Dave Kinnaman is involved in it, and I don't remember the research group that does it, but it's called Faith for Exiles, and it's about this like movement away from the gathering of the church and what it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a really interesting read, especially now that gathering is defined differently. Like we can't do it the same way. So losing that behavior, what does it do? But getting back on track.
Yeah, we're really good at getting our show about being on track, off track, aren't we?
Yeah. But and
we'll get that in the show notes, definitely.
Yeah, it's a good book. And it's one of the people we work with at Lead NYC has he's presented about it multiple times. So I've read it a few times now, and I always take something away from it, especially because it's talking about the generational movement away from church. So like looking at boomers versus millennials versus Gen Xers, and like what does that look like?
Wow.
But it's really interesting.
Sounds great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Last thing I want to say about this point before we move on, Lindsay, is I think understanding this, it doesn't diminish worship. I think it elevates its importance and significance. Because going to worship is not the purpose of being a Christian. I think it heightens what happens in worship. So when we gather for worship, we are renewed, we are re-equipped, we are reformed for the work that God has prepared for us.
Yeah.
The work that He's called us to do, mostly when we're not together, when we're scattered, when we're alone, we're out in the community, and when we love people, we hurt with them. When we look to have spiritual conversations with people, it may not always go well. All that, we come back we may come back beat up, frazzled, discouraged, or just tired. Even if everything's gone well, we can just be tired. And so when we come back together for worship, our tanks get filled back up, and we experience God's grace and renewal and forgiveness. Not simply for the sake of basking in it, but because we need it. And we can leave encouraged for the week ahead, for the mission that God has for us for that week.
Yeah. It's very interesting. So thirdly, church members need us to empower them for their calling as the church scattered. So why don't you expand on that?
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. I got to work on like shorter, catchier. These aren't they don't rhyme. They're not alliterative.
But they're saying something important. It's good.
So if you're listening and you're a leader in your church, whether you're a pastor, elder, or a ministry leader, a team member, if you're actively serving in the church, the people in our churches they're counting on us to help them see and understand and be equipped for their calling as the church scattered, for all the things that God has in store for us to do that happen when we're not all together. And this can be hard to see because the church of the last 100 years has really been built upon, all of our ministries and programs have been built on, they've relied on uh, being able to count on many church members to be able to give 5 to 10 hours a week of their leisure time
Mm-hmm.
to volunteer in the church. And we have seen people have less and less of that time, or they are going to give less and less of that time. We have also seen like lots of families go from single income families to dual income families. And so we have fewer families, families where um, there's a stay-at-home mom that can come and bring the kids to church and volunteer a whole day in the middle of the week
Yeah.
to do whatever. And yet our ministry model is kind of built on that, like that we're going to do what we do as a church when we're gathered through the programs that we run.
Mm-hmm.
So um, we can really empower people for their calling instead of making them feel guilty that they're not going to come and volunteer on the committee or the program that we have. That we can refocus our teaching instead of us using their leisure time for volunteer hours, that instead we help them to be the church at home, at work, and at play. And I think this really greatly increases our chances of impacting the community. If you
Mm-hmm.
think about, um, when we're together on Sunday morning, we're all in the same building, in the same spot in town. And if we think that's where we're going to impact our community, it's not likely. That's not
Yeah.
likely the first place, right? But we think
Yeah.
about if you could put a map of your town and put a thumbtack where each person of your church is, Wednesday at 11 a.m. Right? People are in their homes, in
Yeah.
their neighborhoods, at work, all over the place. That's where they're going to rub shoulders with people in the community.
Mm-hmm.
That's where we're going to impact our communities, share the gospel, join God in his mission. So helping people recognize opportunities at home and at work are really important. Teaching people how to have conversations about their spirituality. Um, just teaching people how to get to know their neighbors. Many times people in our churches, because we've so stressed the gathered aspect of our church, that we've re-socialized them, that many people in our churches no longer have friends that aren't Christians. Like all their friends are friends
Yeah.
at church.
Yeah, absolutely. I see that happening every day. I think that's a very natural thing to happen.
Yeah.
And it is, yeah.
Yeah. So I I know of a church that one summer they offered mini grants, like $50 or $100 if you want to have a neighborhood cookout. If you want to have a cookout at your house and invite your neighbors, no agenda, no
Yeah.
like gotcha gospel presentation, just
like
spend time with your
like one
neighbors.
of those timeshare things where it's like you can
Yeah.
have a free vacation, but we have to sell this to you for 3 hours in the middle of one of your days.
Yeah. Yeah. None of that. Just have a meal with your neighbors, cook them a
Yeah.
meal. So they would say, if you're going to do that, here's $100 or $50, and we'll
Yeah.
pay for the food. That kind of thing can have a real huge impact. I think also getting back to teaching a theology of vocation, like
Mm-hmm.
God, your work, whatever work it is you do, no matter your job, that's a calling that God has placed in your life, and it's a place where you serve Him and honor Him.
Mm-hmm.
And I think recapturing and understanding of that is really powerful. There's a guy an author named Neil Hudson, who talks about helping people see what he calls their front lines. That when we're scattered, we're out at the front lines of our mission fields, at home, at work, in our neighborhoods, at community events. That those are places of significance where God is working in people's lives and hearts, and we get to encounter them there and become a part of their lives.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, COVID has restricted us in a lot of ways, and it's given our churches opportunities to do this kind of stuff in new ways. And,
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, the data seems to be showing that most churches during this time have become more and more inwardly focused and more focused on trying to regather. But it's not too late to find ways, new opportunities to be the church as we're scattered.
Mm-hmm.
Because people are still leery about getting together in buildings and coming together for big programs, but talking over the fence with your neighbor, that your connections at work and at home. I mean, those are the things that are going to start happening again first. And there are so many great opportunities there. We don't want to miss them. And it's not too late for your church to equip your people to be the church scattered during this unique time where people in our neighborhoods have experienced trauma, loss, potentially abuse during this time, loss of income. They're
Probably
facing
mental
death.
health ramifications as well. Yeah.
So those are, God's calling us to be engaged with our neighbors during this time, like in a new way that wasn't maybe the case a year ago.
But like you said, it's still under the umbrella of the church. Like we are still the church, even though we're scattered in that way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's right, Lindsay.
Yeah. So Ryan, you have a book recommendation. Am I right?
I do have a book recommendation. What did I do with it? Okay. So today's book I'm recommending is Imagine Church, Releasing Whole Life Disciples by Neil Hudson. We'll put that in the show notes. But this book basically gives you, if you listen to this episode today and you're like, okay, our church needs this, and this guy has like a whole pathway for how your church can begin to gradually influence these kinds of changes in your church. And Lindsay, what was that book you mentioned again?
The book I mentioned is called Faith for Exiles, and it's by David Kinnaman and Mark Matlock. They wrote a couple other books like Unchristian and You Lost Me, and it's all about this movement away from the church and looking at it in a generational viewpoint of like what's different between the boomers and the millennials and Gen Xers and Gen Zers. And it's just interesting to see. And they actually call it 5 ways for a new generation to follow Jesus in a digital Babylon. And this was written before the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is, I think churches have gotten exponentially more digital in the last year. And so I'd love, it's a good read. It's very insightful into the current age and demographics. So
yeah, awesome. That sounds great.
Yeah.
Thanks for the recommendation.
Well, thank you everybody for listening. I am just thrilled to be here again. Just thrilled to be a part of it. Love to talk. Yeah. Thank you. Love talking to Ryan today. Thank you just so much for your insight into what really is a very modern dilemma for the church. And don't forget to subscribe. We'd love it if you'd share the podcast with friends, colleagues, anyone you think who could benefit from the message. And thank you for listening, and see you next time.
This has been an episode of the CLB Forge podcast, brought to you by CLB North American Mission. Thanks for listening. We welcome your questions and comments. Email us at podcast@clbforge.org.